the day in the life of Augustine Amaya.
A violent gust of wind blew her wrapper against her thighs and almost knocked her over. She was forced to set her basket on the ground, rearrange her clothing, and tighten her head tie before grabbing it again and picking up the pace. It was threatening to rain, and at any moment, the large drops that come with the end of the rainy season tropical storms would come crashing down. Even if she decided to run, she wouldn't beat the rain. The Mungali roundabout near to which she lived was still a long way off. She loosened the knot she tied on the side of her wrapper and checked to see how much change she had left, a measly 75 CFA francs. She ran her fingers over the 3 metallic 25-franc coins, jingled them in her hand, hesitated for a moment, and, what the heck, decided she would take the next Fula Fula minibus that came along. She'd had to walk over to the station because there weren't any bus stops at the customs office at the riverside port at Brazzaville's beach. She tried to carry her basket on her head so as to free up her hands, but the wind was blowing too hard, and so she had no choice but to carry it. She moved along as fast as she could, hoping to make it to the station before the storm started. Would she have to come back again tomorrow, all because of this wretched business of a lost identity card? She had no idea how this would all get resolved. She'd already made 3 trips to the police station, and 3 days in a row, she had to go home empty-handed. She'd gotten up at 5 o'clock that morning so as to be one of the first in line, hurried along as she always did, and had made it there by 6:15. There were only 2 people waiting ahead of her. This was her lucky day because the office chief showed up earlier than usual, right around 10 o'clock. By the time he'd rustled through some paperwork, put away a few folders, and given out instructions to his subordinates, it was 11. Amaya's turn came at 11:30. She secretly prayed that the chief was in a good mood.
What do you want?
He asked, busy adjusting the metal attached to the lapel of his jacket bearing an effigy of the party's founder.
I'm back again because of my identity card, which you've misplaced.
I haven't misplaced anything.
He thundered.
This is all because of your own negligence.
But it was your office that made us hand over our cards and
what? It's your own stupid fault for obeying such absurd orders.
But
what?
Nothing, Comrade Chief, sir.
This whole identity card business is really starting to piss me off. I'm going to put an end to it once and for all.
He turned around to glance at the clock affixed to the wall. Her eyes followed the movement of his massive body, puffed out with authority. To the right of the clock hung the portrait of the immortal president, youthful and thick-lipped, dead assassinated by, she wasn't quite sure who, given all the contradictory versions she'd heard. The wall to the left was plastered with slogans that meant nothing to her for the simple reason that she couldn't read. The comrade chief turned back around, glanced at his wristwatch, as if he needed to confirm the time on the clock was accurate, and then mumbled through the mustache adorning his delicate mouth that only ate meat, in the words of one of our most well-known musicians.
Since it's already noon, why don't you come back around 2 o'clock?
But, sir...
He slammed the counter window shut. Amaya wasn't quite sure what to do next. She certainly didn't have enough time to go all the way back to Mongolie, and in any case, that would be a pointless waste of money. She really had no other option but to wait. She left the building and wandered along the jetty. Small vessels docked one after the other, unloading, yelling, screaming women traders who argued with the custom officers.
No, come back.
These men were the absolute masters of the place, grabbing hold of them, harassing them, barking orders, and lashing out with their batons when they didn't react quick enough, or they just confiscated their merchandise and only agreed to hand it back in exchange for some form of payment. The women were used to the beatings, the slurs, insults, and outrages at the hands of these customs officers, since from as far back as they could remember, all forms of authority, whether colonial or post-colonial, reforming or redemptive, reactionary or revolutionary, or for that matter, adherents of Bantu socialism or scientific Marxist-Leninist socialism, had treated them with the same contempt. The very idea of a world in which all citizens, no matter whether they were men or women, would be treated with a little more dignity, compassion, or understanding was beyond their wildest imagination. And they were there each and every day under the scorching hot sun, pushed and shoved, having to be extra vigilant whenever a customs officer or other shady character came a little too close to their goods.
Amaya also made her living in the small trade business, taking advantage of the drop in the Zaire on the black market. She would cross the river to Kinshasa and buy a range of products, butter, oil, soap, flour, to name just a few, and then sell them piecemeal that same evening once back in her neighborhood in Brazzaville, under the light of a candle made from a piece of cloth soaked in kerosene. During the daytime, she would set up at the market next to the station where the best deals were to be had. But they'd recently been chased out of there, booted out by the soldiers, and then by the shovels and bulldozers, all because the market just happened to be on the president's new daily route. His security detail couldn't be bothered when it came to the livelihood of the little people. Her margins weren't great, but still enough to be able to feed the 6 kids she had left out of the 8 her ex-husband had abandoned her with. One had died from malaria when he was only 10 months old, and the other, a girl aged 11, a young pioneer in the party's youth organization, had been crushed by a tank during the annual parade celebrating the revolution. After 13 years of marriage, her husband had abandoned her for an improper wedding to a younger, more educated woman, one more worthy for a man newly appointed to a high-ranking political and trade union job after languishing for the past 15 years in a dead-end office job. And so she'd had to fend for herself in a rental unit with 6 kids to take care of. Unable to read or write, but still with enough dignity not to turn to prostitution, which had become a common choice these days. She'd found the courage, and with the limited resources at her disposal, to try her luck in the retail trade. Her ex-husband, now a member of the avant-garde single party, was untouchable. Taking him to court in the hope of getting him to pay some kind of child support was out of the question. And in any case, given her level of education, she had no idea this was even an option. Hasn't phallocratic society always been this way? Men are free to seduce and abandon women. A husband could have several mistresses and no one would bat an eye. but if a woman so much as had an accidental lover, she would be pilloried and driven out of the family home.
Another vessel pulled away from the landing, slicing the Congo River and leaving behind churning froth as it made its way over to Kinshasa, the yellow and green Zairian flag waving in the wind. Black and white feathered birds whose names she didn't know played in the water and the wind, following the boat, at times flying on ahead and then back over the stern to dive for fish. She stared across the river into the distance at the capital of the former Belgian colony, proudly displaying its high-rises. Eventually, she looked at the waters below her, on which mats of white flowering water hyacinths drifted nonchalantly. She asked someone for the time.
It's 1:05, ma'am.
She still had an hour to wait. She was hungry. She untied the knot in her wrapper where she'd put 300 francs. She brought a small piece of cassava bread for 100 francs, roasted safu for 50, and ripe bananas for the same price. She went and sat under the kapok tree next to the customs hall and ate her lunch. Then she was thirsty, so she bought some heavily spiced tangawizi for 25 francs and went to take up position in front of the comrade chief's counter. She was lucky to be the first in line. She started her wait. Ote telema yakawa. Ote telema yakawa.
Mangabati, Bati Telema Yaka.
2:45 p.m., the comrade chief arrived. Amaya secretly and quietly prayed that everything would work out this time. The alternative meant starvation for her large family. She hadn't been able to go over to Kinshasa for 3 days, and she exhausted her supplies. And it was almost the end of the month, which meant that the rent would soon be due. The landlords were an odd bunch. A civil servant could not pay rent for 2 months, and they wouldn't say a word. They just blamed the state for only paying employees every 2 or 3 months. But when a poor woman trader was a few days late, they would threaten to evict her.
Please, God, make this identity card problem go away. What on earth were they thinking, changing the rules like this? In the past, we always held on to our cards for the return journey. Now we had to surrender it at the boredom customs office.
That's why 4 days ago now, she'd left it at the office as instructed, and then spent the day in Zaire before making her way back with the goods. When the time came to retrieve her card, it was nowhere to be found. They'd asked her to come back the next day, and then the day after that, and then the day after that one. They treated her as if she was responsible for its loss, and this was preventing her from going about her daily business.
During the colonial era, it had been relatively straightforward going to Kinshasa, but today it was much more complicated, and you needed all kinds of documents. Of course, she understood the need for strict control over the crossings, because they'd explained on the radio how the revolution was threatened by bourgeois bureaucrats. She still wasn't quite sure what that meant exactly, how it was under continuous attack, just like Vietnam had been, and that it had to be defended. Perhaps misplacing the identity cards of poor traders was part of the plan to defend the revolution. Who was she to disagree? The service window opened. This startled her, rousing her from her thoughts. She approached the counter, hesitantly, doing her best to hold back the people in the line behind her that started to surge forward.
So,
The comrade in charge and party member growled once again.
what do you want?
I was here already this morning, and you asked me to come back this afternoon. I'm here because of the identity card your services have not been able to find.
Oh yeah. I remember. I just had a word about this with one of my deputies, and they're looking into it. Come back tomorrow morning. Next!
Amaya thought she was going to burst into tears, and she had to make a big effort not to. Another wasted day, another day of lost business. Will tomorrow be another day? Her legs felt unsteady as she left the building, and once she adjusted to the sounds and heat outside, she started walking slowly.
A gust of wind sent the leaves swirling in a kind of devil's dance. Amaya was suddenly reminded of her youngest child, a little girl who had started a malaria fever the previous night. She'd given her a chloroquine tablet, but would that be enough to cure her? Worried, she hurried along, almost running, and arrived at the station out of breath. All the Fula buses stopped there, blue monsters, large, uncomfortable beetles that people stormed onto like when the doors opened to the movie theaters in Mungali.
2 left, then a third one.
She untied the knot in her wrapper and got out a 25-franc coin, then retied it. She made sure her wrapper was tightly secured around her waist and jumped into the fray.
100 or so people were trying to board a bus that could hold only 30.
People were pushing and shoving, kicking and swearing at one another.
She found a way to balance herself on the footboard, and as she tried to grab hold of the guardrail attached to the vehicle, the ticket controller shouted out,
Bully!
the code word signaling to the driver that he could leave.
Tires screeched and the bus pulled away violently.
Amaya was thrown backward, but her foot got caught between the risers, and she was dragged for almost 30 feet to the screams of horrified onlookers.
She eventually managed to free her foot and landed on the hard asphalt while the bus continued on its journey, disappearing into the distance somewhere in the vicinity of the Monoprix store.
She somehow managed to get up, picked up the pieces of her torn wrapper, dusted herself off, and wiped some of the blood from her scratches.
A kind-hearted soul handed her her basket.
She thanked her with serenity and gathered up the rest of her scattered belongings.
The first drops of rain started to fall, followed shortly thereafter by a heavy tropical downpour.
Augustine Amaya secured her basket on her head, and with great dignity, her frail silhouette glistening in the rain, could be seen walking off into the distance in the direction of the Poto roundabout.
Will tomorrow be another day?
Thank you. Wow. I'm going to make people so you can hear the applause. Thank you. Thank you.
Well done.
Yep.
still on mute.